Jewish Education in Media is pleased to present L'Chaim, a program that highlights the people, issues, and events of importance to the Jewish community. Now here is your host, Rabbi Mark Golub.
I'm Mark Golub, and there are certain family names in the Jewish world which have special stature due to the contribution people with that name have made to Jewish life. No family name is more universally respected in the Jewish world, if not revered, than is the name Twerski, which refers to a virtual dynasty of extraordinary Hasidic rabbis who've had an enormous positive impact on Jewish communities for more than 100 years. And on this edition of L'Chaim, how lucky are we? I am especially honored to welcome Abraham Joshua Twerski, son of Grand Rabbi Jacob Israel Twerski. And Abraham Twerski is not only a Hasidic rabbi, but he's also one of the most highly regarded psychiatrists in America who specialized in treating patients suffering from substance abuse. Rabbi Twerski founded the Gateway Rehabilitation Center of Pittsburgh. He's the founder of Sha'ar HaTikvah, a rehabilitation center for prisoners in Israel. He's a prolific writer of more than 60 books, including The Rabbi and the Nuns, which describe Dr. Twerski's relationship with the Sisters of St. Francis. The Rabbi and the Nuns, the inside story of a rabbi's therapeutic work with the Sisters of St. Francis, published by Twerski, and it's an extraordinary read, and this is an extraordinary human being, and I was telling him before we began, I am always honored to have somebody in that chair, never more honored than having you here. I've watched your career, I know what you've contributed. When I lead high holiday services, I often quote you, and I'm so pleased to be able to present you now to the L'Chaim audience here on Shalom TV. Thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
Having you also, there's so many questions I want to begin with. And I guess to start with, I just want you to talk a little bit about your own Jewish life and your own Jewish background. Tell our audience where you were born.
I was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
And your parents were?
My father was a Hasidic Rebbe.
Named?
Rabbi Jacob Twerski.
Israel.
Came to America in 1927.
Yes.
And after a brief period in New York, moved to Milwaukee. And I grew up in Milwaukee.
And where did you go to school?
In Milwaukee, I went to public schools. There was no day school there. Mm-hmm. And I did not get into a yeshiva-type school.
Why not?
Until there was none in Milwaukee.
Why would your father brought his family to Milwaukee to be a rabbi?
Right.
Okay. He was an Orthodox Hasidic rabbi?
Yes.
Okay. And by the way, his father was whom?
His father was Rabbi Leib Twerski of Horno-Steipel in Russia.
Okay. Was it a problem for your father to end up serving as a rabbi in a community that was not as typically observant as his family had been and as he would have wanted for himself and his children?
Someone asked my father, we were 5 boys, and all of us followed the Hasidic line. Someone asked my father, how is it that you were able to raise Torah-observant children in Milwaukee? And my father said, in Milwaukee, I never left Horno-Steipel.
In his mind, he never left. Mm-hmm. By the way, as you look at your own childhood, and it's interesting, you are a revered rabbi. You're also one of the highly respected psychiatrists on the world scene, really. So that I can ask you certain kinds of questions, and I assume you have spent time in self-reflection on this as well. But as you're growing up, a young person in Milwaukee, Is there any difficulty for you and your brothers in navigating the world of your father and the reality of Milwaukee?
None whatsoever. As I said, I grew up, I went to public school. I did not have one observant Jewish friend when I grew up. And one of the advantages of that, if one can say so, is that I always knew that I was different. Right? I didn't have to conform to anything. Right? I was myself. The heritage, you talked about the Twerski dynasty, our heritage was emphasized upon us.
By your parents.
Right. Both from my father and my mother. My father came from the Twerski dynasty. My mother was from the Halberstam dynasty. Right. I had a great-grandmother who developed Alzheimer's disease in her later life. And she once said, "Who I am, I don't know, and where I am, I don't know. But whose I am, I know." She always remembered whose she was, where she came from. And I think that was the crucial factor. Right? We had a heritage to be proud of and a heritage to preserve.
Forgive me, I want to digress. As you look at American Jewry today, for that matter, as you look at Israeli Jewry, do we, American and Israeli Jews, understand the important insights your mother passed down to you? Do you feel that we know enough about where we came from and who we are?
Obviously, many people who are Torah scholars do have an idea of where they came from, but not necessarily all of them, because there are some very fine Torah scholars that are very knowledgeable in Talmud, but know nothing about Jewish history. And this was a glaring deficiency. It was and still is, that people do not know about Jewish history. And certainly secular Jews may be totally unaware. And I sometimes say, isn't it a shame that a youngster, a Jewish youngster, oh yes, I know who Longfellow was. Who was Yehuda Levi? No knowledge. Right? And I'd say, if we don't have self-respect, how can we expect others to respect us? Right? I mean, we have had poets, Ibn Gabriel, Yehuda Levi. You look through the prayers, the piyutim, the lyrics, an enormous amount of poetry, right?
Stunning poetry.
Right. The Kalir, whoever he was, nobody's certain at what point in history he lived, but just a flowing flow of poetry, and people don't know it. Right? Yeah.
It's not just Torah scholars that I'm concerned with. Torah scholars have a real shot at understanding. As I experience just people, just the Jew, the average Jew in the street, we are going through a period of time when there is not enormous degree of Jewish literacy. And we suffer from that. You're growing up in Milwaukee in a public school. Where do you learn Talmud? Where do you learn Jewish history? Where do you learn about Yehuda Levi?
Well, this was emphasized for us. By the way, there's another aspect, of course, that has been lost almost, and that is the Yiddish aspect of Judaism, right? I did not speak a word of English until I was in first grade. Right? Yiddish was my first language. Now, over the past 70 years, it's dwindled, but I was turned on to Yiddish literature. Right? My grandmother knew Shalom Aleichem verbatim. Right? My wife and I spend evenings sometimes still reading Shalom Aleichem. And that was a great deal of historic wealth. I mean, Shalom Aleichem was not just fictional stories, right? He portrayed a culture, right, that is totally unknown to us, right? So I was exposed to that, and we were, in my father's home, we were never afraid that secular studies would divert us from our Jewishness.
And there was no contradiction in your family's home between Jewish studies and secular studies.
No.
They were all, in essence, in the larger sense, Torah.
Right, right. Well, we knew that, for example, some of our greatest Torah sages, the Gaon of Vilna, composed a book on geometry. Right? Ibn Ezra composed a book on geometry. At one time, the Gaon is quoted as having said, it was quoted by one of his students, that to the degree that a person lacks knowledge of science, right, he lacks tenfold knowledge of Torah, right? So it all could be one.
And Rabbi Twerski, when you look at some of the more, I'm going to use now the phrase that is used, popular phrase, the ultra-Orthodox view of what learning is, and it is exclusively Talmudic learning, Talmud Torah learning, and that there's a lack of appreciation for the breadth of learning that the Jew is really, it's a mitzvah to learn about the world we live in.
Of course.
What do you say to yourself about this more narrow approach, which very often is presented as if it is authentic Jewish tradition?
What I say to myself is that I wish that I had the opportunity to make some changes, but that's beating your head against a brick wall. Mm-hmm. Now, I know where it came from. They were circling the wagons to prevent outside influence that could be harmful, that could be noxious, and I understand that. But at the same time, the expression it used, it narrows you. And incidentally, I very often quote the Rambam, who, in addition to being the greatest codifier of law, was a physician, a philosopher. But the Rambam, in his halacha, says there is a mitzvah to develop love for God and reverence for God. Now, how does this happen? How do you do so? And here are his words. If a person will concentrate on the wonders of creation, right, he'll come to have a respect and love for God, right? And what he's saying is, you have to know the beauty and the greatness of the natural world. Mm-hmm. Right? So I think it's unfortunate that the education has turned out to be so narrow.
May I say, just as an aside, you look like a very Orthodox Jew. You look like a Jew who ultimately is representing thousands of years of Jewish tradition. If I did not see you, and I only heard your voice and heard the content of your message, it sounds enormously contemporary. And this is not to suggest in any way, and unfortunately, we live at a time when everybody wants to pigeonhole and everybody wants to put us into little boxes. But there is an approach that you represent that is not normally associated with Hasidic traditional Judaism. Do you know what I'm referring to?
Oh, yes. But the good news, here and there, I see some changes creeping in. Right? I think we now have, what we did not have before, institutions of secular knowledge for the Orthodox and for the Hasidic group, such as Torah College. Mm-hmm. Right? And in Israel, there are similar developments of bridging the gap. And there may be some fortunate changes coming.
Mm-hmm. So you're in a secular school as a young person. And then what happens after high school?
In high school, I went to a yeshiva, which had in Chicago, which had a yeshiva high school, very small high school. And
was it a good experience for you?
Oh, it was a great experience. The best part of the experience was where was very small. The classes had 4 or 5 students in the class, so we had individual attention.
Good teachers.
Right, good teachers. So it was a great experience.
After high school, what do you do?
Yeah. First of all, after high school, I spent 1 year totally learning Torah with my late uncle, the Rebbe of Bobov in Brooklyn. And then at that point, my oldest brother was rabbi in Denver, and he was expert in halakha. And so I spent a year with him learning halakha. Mm-hmm. But I did not want to be a pulpit rabbi.
Because?
Because I did not want to be at the mercy of a board of directors who, if they were displeased with me, would send me the contract in the mail. Now,
you were a little rebel.
That was not exactly a legitimate fear, because, you see, my father had built the congregation, the shul in Milwaukee, and it was his shul.
Yes.
And he wanted me to take over the shul after he retired. So that was not a realistic fear that I would be at the mercy of a. But I did get my semicha then when I was 21, and I became his assistant rabbi.
Was there ambivalence in you at this point?
No.
You were happy doing this?
I was, well, for a while. But you see, what happened is this. My father was an intuitive psychotherapist. Never had any courses, but unbelievably insightful. People used to come to him, religious, non-religious, unaffiliated, non-Jewish. The courts would send cases to him, and they said, take this case to Rabbi Twerski. And his study was buzzing with people looking for his counsel from till 2, 3 in the morning. When I grew up, that is what I envisioned that if I became a rabbi, I would do.
Help people.
Right. But you see, what happened was that I got my smicha in 1951, and I became his assistant rabbi. After World War II, psychology and psychiatry, which had been essentially neglected, had a meteoric rise. And I realized, after being in the rabbinate for 2 or 3 years, that people are not going to seek my counsel like they did my father's, because the cloak of authority in counseling had now gone to a professional psychologist or psychiatrist. And that's what it was. So what am I going to do as a rabbi? Mm-hmm. I will give bar mitzvah sermons. I will do ceremonials, right? Funerals, weddings, unveiling. And I said, that's not the life I wanted. What I wanted to do was I wanted to be the kind of counselor helping people like my father did. But now that's gone to psychiatry, so then I'll become a psychiatrist, right? So I went to become a psychiatrist to do what I had hoped to do as a rabbi.
Mm-hmm. Where did you study?
Marquette University, a Jesuit school.
Don't you find, though, when you read that about you, that you chose a Jesuit school, there's something like, what? Why that? Why Marquette?
Well,
and obviously location may have been a factor. Okay, but was there any intellectual, theological, emotional contradiction for you? Was there any problem because you were in a Jesuit school?
Not that I'm aware of. No, I can't tell you what my unconscious is, but consciously, no problem.
Okay. You enjoyed the process?
Yes.
Okay. And you become a doctor, a psychiatrist, roughly when?
I graduated my medical school in 1959, did a year of general internship, and then in 1960 I went to the University of Pittsburgh, which was a Orthodox psychoanalytic institute, strictly Freud. right? And spent 3 years there.
Do you consider yourself, by the way, a disciple of Freud?
I consider myself someone who appreciates the enormity of Freud's contributions. However, I do not smoke cigars because Freud smoked cigars.
I hope everybody understands the allusion. Okay, very, very good. I know it's simplistic, but is there some way in which, the way in which Freud tends to separate aspects of personality and the id and the ego and libido, does it in any way resonate with you in a fashion that reflects the rabbinic insight about the Yetzer Tov and the Yetzer Hara?
Very definitely.
Explain to our audience why.
Well, first of all, Freud had the tripartite thing, id, ego, superego. The Musar, the ethical, the Jewish ethics, talk about Yetzer Tov and Yetzer Hara, which is essentially the id and the superego.
Exactly.
Right. Freud had the pleasure principle and the reality principle. Right? I mean, Freud built an enormous structure of psychological knowledge. It's just that not all of his theories, and particularly putting them into practice, was very, very practical.
You talk a lot about your connection with the theology that you encountered when you were working with the nuns. And at one point you discuss the extent to which you, as a traditional Jew, are in some way, the notion of original sin is something which meant something enormous to the nuns, to which it means nothing to the Jew. Take a moment, explain to our audience. I've always argued that if you want to understand the difference between Judaism and Christianity, it's really not about whether Jesus was the Messiah or not. It was, what do you believe human nature is all about? And if you understand what the principle and the philosophy of human nature is, you understand why Judaism went in one direction and why Christianity went in a different direction. Talk for a moment about your understanding of why the issue of original sin, which is something Jews do not embrace, is a major distinction for you between Judaism and Christianity.
You see, my feeling, and this is something that I inherited from my father, when someone would tell my father about, that person, he's an evil person, and my father said, there is no such thing as a bad Jew. There is a foolish Jew, right? But there is inherent goodness in everyone. I grew up with that idea. I worked for 40 years treating alcoholics and addicts, some of whom would be looked upon by other people as the scum. Right? I had a great deal of success, and I think much of that success was due because any client of mine knew that I valued him or her. Right? Someone once asked me, how did you ever get time to write 70 books? I said, I never wrote 70 books. I wrote one book in 70 different ways. And the one book that I wrote about is the book of self-esteem, right? That a person should have a sense of self-worth. I apply this everywhere. I apply this to the addict when I tell the addict, if you only knew that you were precious and beautiful, you would not do anything to harm yourself. Now, original sin means that man is inherently evil, right? And I have in my book, when I had sessions with the nuns, when I told them, yes, I believe in original sin. I believe original sin is then thinking yourself to be worthless, right? That's the sin that we deal with. So I think the idea of the inherent goodness of every person, as I understand it, is the antithesis of original sin. Right? And that's where we part company.
in your experience, there's good in everyone?
There's no good in Hitler. There's no good in Genghis Khan. There's no good in Stalin. But except for those cases where some people have been satanic in origin, right? I think there's good in everyone.
Okay. If I say that people are basically good and that we struggle to somehow bring that out in us, and from the Jewish perspective, Torah is a way in which we learn better and better how to accentuate the Yetzer Tov in us and to limit the Yetzer Hara. Although it's interesting that in the Jewish tradition, even the Yetzer Hara is believed, A, to come from God, and also can really be one of the most important driving forces of human existence. And that's a radically different view than you find in most other philosophical religious traditions. Right. That the Yetzer Hara, which is normally translated as an inclination towards evil, selfishness, ego, whatever it is, that the rabbis say, were it not for the Yetzer Hara, so much of civilization would never have occurred. And I guess I'm asking you the extent to which you also find that instinctively, if people are left alone around other lovely people, will they be destructive, or do you find in your experience lovely people tend to, in some way, generate loveliness and even influence others to become lovely?
No, I do think that environment has a great impact, and being around good, generous people will stimulate the person to adapt those traits. Conversely, being around destructive people is very likely to cause a person to develop destructive traits. But ultimately, every individual is responsible for oneself, right? And although environment is a factor, it cannot be used as an excuse.
Which tends to be done all the time now in our society, yes?
Oh, yes. Our society takes you got to blame somebody for something. Mm-hmm. You see, the whole business of blaming, and this is one of the things that I think went wrong with Freudian psychology. The mechanism of blame is that if I can blame someone for something, that takes off of me the onus of having to do something about it. Not my fault, it's his fault. Huh? And psychiatrically, it's my parents' fault the way they raised me, right? So I can blame my parents, right? I don't have the responsibility of making the correction. And so I put that idea to sleep when patients start talking to me about their parents and the father did this and mother did that. I say, look, even if you are now what your parents made you, if you stay that way, it's your own damn fault. Right?
Yes. Was your relationship with your own parents?
I'm sorry?
Did you have good relationships with your own parents?
Very excellent relationship.
And a good relationship with your father?
Yeah, I was my father's favorite.
And you enjoyed it?
Oh, yes.
Okay. Because I was wondering, again, in stereotypical fashion, and yet there was some profundity in it, many Jews only know about your world because they read something like Chaim Potak's The Chosen. And, I don't know, did you ever know Chaim Potak?
No.
Okay. So are you aware how he came to write The Chosen?
No.
This is interesting. As a psychiatrist, you'll find this interesting. Chaim Potak came from a very traditional home. He always wanted to be a painter. And his parents wouldn't let him paint because they said Jews don't make images. And being a painter was unacceptable. So he moved to being a writer. And to help himself write, he decided he needed to expand his education. And he wanted to become a rabbi and study at the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, the Conservative Movement's rabbinical school, and he enrolls in JTS. He tells me because he thought it would help him as a novelist. And when he leaves the house the first day to go to JTS on the subway, as he's walking out the door, his father says to him, as he's going to JTS, don't become a goy. He goes to JTS. He has an interesting experience there. And because he's a rabbi now, he has to go into the chaplaincy. And he becomes a chaplain during the Korean War. And during the Korean War, he sees a conflict between the American cultural view and the Asian cultural view, the Korean cultural view. And he decides to write this conflict and the way in which the cultures clash, but using his own model. And his own model is the Jewish tradition. And so he writes a story about an Orthodox Hasidic boy who has a best friend who is a modern Jew, comes from a modern Jewish family, that is not an observant, although somewhat learned. And there is this description of how the two get along. Meanwhile, the Hasidic Orthodox son, who's one of the major characters of the book, has a very tempestuous relationship with his own father, who is very hard on him. In the end, the son comes to realize the father is hard on him because it's almost like a trial by fire, and he believes his son can become a great Rebbe himself, and does later on in life. And that's the model that most of us sort of know in general about the conflict between the Hasidic Orthodox world and the, quote, modern world. And one of the things I wondered about was the extent to which you, who have come from such a rich Orthodox Hasidic tradition, and yet at the same time have become a preeminent psychiatrist on the world scene, whether there was ever a conflict for you that was sort of the conflict of the chosen, where you had to make choices yourself about what direction you went in. Were you ever betraying anything that was in the Jewish tradition? Did your father ever say to you, why are you becoming a psychiatrist? I wanted you to be a rabbi. Was anything of this a part of your own human experience?
Not at all. My father was thrilled that I became a physician. I think that he had a secret wish to have been a physician himself. He used to visit the hospitals every day to see patients for Bikur Cholim, and became extremely knowledgeable in medicine. So he enjoyed my becoming a physician. When I chose psychiatry, he wanted to know a little bit about what psychiatry was. And when I told him a little bit about psychoanalysis, he sort of poo-pooed that. But all the way to the end of his life, he was very supportive and very proud that I was a psychiatrist.
At any point in your own experience, whether you were a kid in school in Milwaukee, or you're at Marquette, or you're trying to do something after you become first a physician, then a psychiatrist, did you ever experience or have to deal with anti-Semitism? Anti-Semitism.
Of course there was some anti-Semitism. Milwaukee was a beautiful city, but there was a strong German population, a strong Polish population, right? And there was anti-Semitism, and we felt it, right? But it was accepted as one of the unfortunate evils of the world. And so, Jacob and Esau fought within their mother's womb, right? And that's the reality, that there's always been hatred toward the Jews throughout history, and this is no different. The interesting thing was that my relationship with not only the sisters, but with the bishop, the cardinal, with whom I was great friends, we knew very well what the history of the church was with the Jews, right? But we were occupied in doing something for humanity, and we cooperated wonderfully, and we respected each other, and that never became an issue.
Mm-hmm. By the way, you've written about how you helped those in the clergy and the Catholic clergy who had a problem with alcoholism.
Oh, yes.
Correct?
Yes.
Tell the audience that story. How ultimately one of the things you were able to do was get sort of special permission for priests who would normally have to drink wine, and for an alcoholic, any contact at all with any alcohol, including wine during a religious ceremonial rite, could create enormous problems. And so you were asked to intervene. What happened?
Well, what happened was that this young man, as a 34-year-old priest, was admitted because of severe alcoholism, and he went into a severe psychotic withdrawal state. Right? We had to put him in the intensive care unit for 5 days, and he almost died. Right? The day after he came out of the intensive care unit, he asked repeatedly for mouthwash because it contains alcohol. And I said to him, Father, you were almost dead from alcohol. And I said, look, you have no control whatever. You are going to have to take a medication that will make it impossible for you to drink. It's called antabuse. And if you're on that medication, 1 drop of alcohol will make you deathly sick. So he says, well, I can't take that because I can't say the Mass. I said, why can't you say the Mass? I have to have a sip of wine. I said, no, you can use grape juice. He says, no, we can't. We have to use wine. I went down to my office. I called the cardinal to the Vatican, and I said, Cardinal Wright, do me a favor. Get me a dispensation for this young man.
You called the cardinal?
Yeah.
You just picked up the phone and called the cardinal?
Right.
You knew him from before?
Yeah, he was Bishop of Pittsburgh.
And you had known him when he was in Pittsburgh?
Right.
Okay.
So I said, get me a dispensation. And he said to me, Rabbi, I will personally hand carry it to the Holy Father. 24 hours later, he called me that Pope Paul VI get dispensation for all alcoholic priests that they may use grape juice.
Just an amazing
And so
story.
I said, Cardinal, tell the Pope that he had a mitzvah.
I want to come back to the story you quoted about Jacob and Esau in the womb. And I'm just playing the game for 1 second. How do you know about that story?
Well, we're taught about it as kids.
Is it in the Torah?
In the Torah.
It is not in the Torah, is it?
Well, it says that the Torah says that Rebecca was pregnant with twins, and she was very uncomfortable.
She had a hard time. Okay.
And that she went to seek counsel from one of the prophets at that time, Shem, the son of Noah. And what she was told is, you are having 2 children who will always struggle. Right? That's it.
Part of the reason you and I know this is because it's also in the midrash.
Right.
And I wanted to know the extent to which you, as again a Jew who was brought up in a very traditional setting, were exposed to the breadth of midrash, and how the midrash very often, number one, lives with ambivalence, which as a psychiatrist, you understand how important ambivalence is in a person's life. But the midrash lives with ambivalence. Halakha does not, but midrash does. And if one is exposed to midrash in a positive way, and midrash again is this collection of rabbinic thought, which very often is based on a biblical text, but in other words, it allows for Jewish imagination and for the Jew to find inside the text layers and layers and layers of story and detail and meaning. And it is the midrash in many ways that really is the soul of the Jewish people, which then leads to whatever kind of approach any Jew adopts, including a halakhic approach. I wanted to know the extent to which you, as a traditionally educated Jew, were exposed to midrash, and whether you feel it has had any impact on your own thinking.
It had to have an impact.
You were exposed.
Of course. But as you said, I don't know that the word ambivalent is quite right, because our instructor was a stickler about words, and he would say, no, when there is a conflict or a difference of opinion,
or a contradiction,
right, don't call that ambivalence. Psychologically, ambivalence is a narrow term meaning love and hate toward the same object. So I can't say that the midrash is ambivalent, but there are certainly a lot of divergences in midrash, conflicting opinions.
Yes.
And secondly, so much of midrash was versed in a way, because there were things that could not have been said very clearly, manifestly. And much of midrash is like a code, right? And you have to be able to decode what they were saying, right?
You have described yourself. You tell me whether I've got this right. You seem to have described yourself as an arch conservative who opposes change in religion. That quote comes from your book, in which you're talking to the nuns. To what extent, Rabbi Twerski, is that who you are? You're an arch conservative who opposes change in religion.
Right.
It is who you are.
That, right.
Okay. Do you oppose change in general?
No. I think that there are many excellent changes. But inasmuch as Torah Judaism, we believe, was given by God at Sinai, right, that there can be no change in what God said. Now, later on, there are interpretations which there may be disagreement about some of the sages of the Talmud or the midrash, right? So there is no one certainty. And the Talmud has a beautiful expression that when two Torah sages, both sincere in their devotion toward Torah, have a difference of opinion, both opinions are right. Mm-hmm. They say, but wait, one says this is kosher, the other says, no, it's treif. Which is right? Both are right. Right? But what are you going to do? Well, we have to have a codifier of laws so that we can practically have one way to do it. But opposing opinions can both be right.
Mm-hmm. Do you ever want to see a change in Jewish law having to do with the rules of the agunah? A wife who's been divorced by a husband who will then not give her a bill of divorce. When you talk about no change in law, how does that apply to what you want to see happen to the halacha regarding the agunah?
Do I wish it were changeable? Right? Yes, I wish it were changeable. Unfortunately, it's cast in stone. And as you pointed out, there are many rabbis who have spent a lifetime trying to find ways to release an agunah. One famous rabbi at one time wrote a suggestion that would essentially, at the time of the marriage, provide an automatic release in case the husband was recalcitrant, did not want to give a get. But he retracted. Right? And it appears that even our greatest Talmudical scholars are helpless in trying to deal with it. And it's probably the single most painful issue in Torah Judaism is the problem of the agunah.
But at the moment, you don't have a suggestion either.
No.
Okay. When you look at non-Orthodox forms of Judaism, and of course in the American model, religious pluralism has been really the sort of the standard bearer of American Jewish life. Do the non-Orthodox forms of Jewish life, does Reform Judaism, Conservative Judaism, Reconstructionist Judaism, anything that's non-Orthodox, are you critical of it?
I'm critical of them because I don't like to see anyone do something which cannot be undone. Right? And if a person wants to violate the laws of kosher, and he wants to eat treif, right? I disagree with him, but obviously he has the freedom to do whatever he wants. If he has a child, I think that he should allow that child to grow up without any bonds that will prevent that child from having a happy life, right? And if he's going to have a relationship that, according to the halakha, is going to make that child illegitimate, right? I think he is abusing a child that he brought into the world. So that's what I'm critical of. So people may do what they want, right? But don't put that kind of a stigma on the child that the child cannot get out of.
And what situations creates that stigma? What situation creates that stigma?
All right? A woman is married, legitimately married, right? She cannot have an adulterous relationship. Mm-hmm. A child born out of adulterous relationship, right, is considered illegitimate, right? She divorces, does not receive a get, remarries without a get, right? According to the halacha, that's an adulterous relationship, and the child is illegitimate. And I think that's a short-sightedness of allowing a child to have to bear that kind of stigma.
You understand that child would only bear that stigma if it became part of the community in which that stigma existed. Most of the people you're describing, and I understand it perfectly, most of the people you're describing, however, are living in a non-Orthodox community.
Right.
And imagine their children to be in a non-Orthodox community. And in the non-Orthodox world, the concern that you describe, which would be very important within the Orthodox community, simply doesn't exist outside the Orthodox community.
Until such time as a non-Orthodox child adopts Orthodoxy and becomes a Baal Tshuva.
Correct. Right? If a non-Orthodox child becomes Orthodox, you cannot escape mamzerut. And technically, this child is now a mamzer, which means illegitimate, and that child cannot marry any Jew who is not a mamzer. In fact, it's more even complicated than that. So what your point is, there's a danger down the road if a child is brought into the world in the situation you described. By the way, that is a very specific, and again, whether people listening to you right now agree with you, they don't agree with you, they relate to it, they don't, you've described something that is real but very narrow. There are so many other things that are part of non-Orthodox Judaism. So that, for example, you have Jews in synagogues all over America who want to observe the Shabbat and be part of a community in a Bet Knesset, in a synagogue on Friday night, but they'll drive. They'll get in their car and they'll drive to services. And by driving to services, lo and behold, they are now in a synagogue and attending a Friday night service. That is not halachically permissible.
Right.
And the conservative movement made a major break when it first said, yes, it would accept the idea of driving only to services, by the way. After services, you shouldn't use the car. But you know, once the door is open, the door is open.
Right.
That's an example of how non-Orthodox Judaism has tried to make compromises, accommodations that seem to work for people who, if there were not those accommodations, they wouldn't be involved in Jewish life at all. What do you feel about those kinds of accommodations in non-Orthodox Jewry?
My feeling is that once you begin to unravel a sweater, it continues to unravel, right? And there's a sliding slope, right? And this is why Orthodoxy halacha has been such that we don't make concessions, and we don't make concessions not because we don't want to, but because we are unable to, right? My father used to tell a story about a young woman who was the daughter of a rabbi, and she was very frum, very, very devout. Right? She developed a terrible disease, and the doctor said that the only thing that can help her is if she eats the liver of a hog. And she absolutely refused. She's not going to eat a hog. She's not going to eat chazer. Well, the rabbis explained to her that the Torah requires you to do what is necessary to save your life. So she can see that if I have to, I have to. But I want the chazer to be ritually shechted.
Slaughtered.
Right. I needed it to slaughter, the ritually slaughtered, because it's bad enough that I eat chazer, I don't have to eat an unslaughtered animal. So the father talked with the shaykhid, and he says, look, the child is sick. Do me a favor, all right? Slaughter the chazer ritually. So, slaughter the chazer. She wants the lungs inspected for a possible lesion, whether it's kosher or not. So they inspect the lungs and they find the lesion. She wants the lungs taken to a rabbi for an opinion. Right? So they take the rabbi to opinion. The rabbi looks at the lung and he says, this particular lesion, if it were in a cow, would be kosher. But how do I pronounce a chazer to be kosher? Right? And I said, people have to understand that we don't have the authority to say that chazar is kosher. Right?
Although, the overarching point of your story is the Jewish tradition mandates that she eat or she take the liver of a non-kosher animal because pikuach nefesh, the idea of saving life suspends all other laws.
Right.
So that what you had here was a punctilious Jewish woman who was trying to observe Jewish law to such a point that it ultimately became ludicrous. Your point is it can go to the ludicrous.
Right.
At the same point, our audience shouldn't miss your larger point that in the Jewish tradition, when it comes to saving life, matters of ritual law, certain
Are all waived, right?
Are waived all the time. All right, I only have a few more minutes with you left, and I want to change focus. I want to put the Jewish tradition aside, and I want to talk to you about you who have helped so many people, Jew and non-Jew, cope with life. And I want you to talk about something that I have read you've done wonderful work in. And again, you'll tell me whether you agree with me or I'm exaggerating. In my own rabbinate, Rabbi Twerski, I find one of the saddest things I encounter is the disharmony that exists within families. That people who love each other, who begin with a profound love for each other, allow incidents to be so hurtful to them. It's the old scene from that classic Jewish movie where the brother sliced the turkey before his brother got there. You shouldn't slice the Thanksgiving turkey till I arrive. And whatever the hurt is, it allows someone to hold a grudge for a long, long time and absolutely destroy family relationships. Very often it's over money. Money can do terrible things to people who love each other, especially when one brother has money and the other doesn't, when one side of the family has money and the other doesn't. And the question becomes, how does one help a family heal a breach, in some way address a grudge, and in some way let go? Am I correct that this is something you've written a great deal about?
I have a whole book entitled Forgiveness.
Okay. I want you to talk for a moment about how you try to help family members and people in general who are just so angry at each other that it gets in the way of what really could be and should be a loving, productive, wonderful relationship.
You see, I think that what we're dealing with is a situation that goes beyond the surface. The problem of families where there is dissension is horrible. When a mother says, I wanted to go to my daughter's wedding, my granddaughter's wedding, but it's so painful to me because my daughter told me that if she invites one of her brothers, the other brother said he will not come. Right? So that kind of bitterness
happens all the time, doesn't it?
Yeah, and it's unfair. Now, I think that psychologically we have to understand this. I wrote this about forgiveness, that our unconscious mind makes up most of our mind. 97% of our mind is unconscious. Our conscious mind, the one we operate with all the time, is paper thin. The unconscious is like the hard drive of a computer. Everything that happens to us is recorded, right? And nothing is automatically deleted. Now, something happens between a brother and sister, or two brothers, that causes some anger between them, right? 2 days later, they forget about it. They've forgotten about it. The unconscious has not, right? That anger is in the unconscious, right? Months go by, another incident happens, right? Again, they gloss it over it. It goes back into the unconscious. Over a period of time, especially in families, so many interactions happen that the unconscious builds up a mountain of resentment, right? And then something happens that it's a pile of dynamite waiting to explode if there's a spark. And then something happens that triggers it, and it blows up into this horrendous, horrendous feud. And I pointed out in my book that when I was a child, I had a playmate and we had a fight, and we'd break up with, "I'm mad at you forever." The next day we were playing together again, right? Because we didn't have time to build up all this resentment. If I can get people to understand not only that resentments are toxic, but what they are resenting now is merely a superficial item and is not really the reason for their anger, and that their anger and their bitterness goes back to something that they don't even know about. It's possible to make some reconciliation, but it takes a lot of work.
Mm-hmm. There is almost nothing more important, it seems to me, than helping people understand. There's nothing to be gained by holding on to a grudge. Do you agree?
First of all, the Torah says you're not allowed to hold on to a grudge, right? And that's the theme of my book, Forgiveness. To forgive someone, you don't have to pick up the telephone and say, "Yankel, I forgive you." No, you don't have to do that. You don't have to tell them. But within your own heart, get rid of that grudge. Right?
Am I correct that you said something like, holding a grudge and retaining a feeling of anger is like letting someone you don't like live in your soul rent-free?
Exactly.
A brilliant insight. And again, it's something I remind myself, and people I speak to all the time, and I always give you credit, and I think it's one of the most important insights, and it comes out of the Jewish tradition, as you point out. There's no point in letting someone live inside your heart rent-free that you don't.
Exactly.
Right?
I'm not that altruistic that I will allow that to happen.
You have made an extraordinary contribution. I started that way. I want you to hear me say it again. It's been an honor just to sit with you and to learn from you. You are always welcome here. I wish you go from strength to strength to strength. Kol tuva hatzlacha in all you do. Continue.
Amen.
Continue to illuminate us and share your insight. Thank you very much. You're very special. Thank you. My conversation with Abraham Joshua Twerski. He's the author of The Rabbi and the Nuns, the inside story of a rabbi's therapeutic work with the Sisters of St. Francis. A fascinating read, and you might want to pick it up. But again, I said he wrote more than 60 books. He says he's written more than 70 books, although interesting, he says it's the same book from a different angle. Very midrashic. It's worth trying to find any book Rabbi Twerski has written. Whatever he has written will help you understand more about yourself and your world and what you want to be. Of course, as always, I hope you'll share your own thoughts and comments to this edition of L'Chaim. Please email me, write me, post on our Facebook wall, tweet me. I look forward to hearing from you. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. L'Chaim, my friends, to life.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support Shalom TV with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the Shalom TV website homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM. To GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive on DVD with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.
L'Chaim is a presentation of Jewish Education in Media.